The man I loved never touched me until the night he sent me away. Everything that came before, every late night, every conversation, every moment I convinced myself meant something, all of it happened in the space between us. A space he refused to close. Until he had no choice. They found me through channels that don't advertise on LinkedIn. A colleague of a colleague, someone who owed someone. The kind of professional network that exists so people like me can pretend we didn't know what we were looking for. I had built a career salvaging dying companies, hostile takeovers, bankruptcy restructures, financial forensics that required equal parts, accounting expertise and moral flexibility. I was good at finding where money went, better at making sure it came back. The offer came through a dinner meeting I didn't want to attend. A restaurant in Brooklyn with no name on the door. The man across from me was American, late 50s, expensive suit. He told me the Volkov family had experienced turbulence, internal financial discrepancies. The kind of questions that, if left unanswered, became problems. I said I didn't work for criminal organizations. He smiled, said they worked in import-export, real estate, private equity. If their methods were aggressive, well, that was simply the cost of competitive business. The lie was so polished, I almost respected it. He slid a folder across the table. The number at the bottom made my breath catch. 6 months, retainer plus bonuses. Enough to clear my student loans, my mother's medical debt, and still have enough left to walk away entirely. I should have said no. I said yes. The Volkov estate was understated, elegant. The kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself. The security, however, was unmistakable. I was met by a woman named Irina, impeccably dressed, efficient. She showed me to my office and gave me one piece of advice. Don't wander. Not all areas were appropriate for guests. The warning was clear. I spent the morning reviewing files. That's when I realized how badly I'd miscalculated. The Volkov organization wasn't experiencing turbulence. It was hemorrhaging. Accounts bleeding into offshore shells that led nowhere. Money moving through channels that looped back on themselves. Someone had systematically dismantled the organization's financial infrastructure from the inside. And someone else had tried very hard to hide it. I was still staring at the screen when the door opened without knocking. And that's when I first saw him. He wasn't what I expected. Where Dmitry Volkov was all presence, loud voice, expansive gestures, this man was the opposite. Quiet, still, the kind of stillness that makes you aware of your own breathing. Tall, dark hair, features that suggested Eastern European heritage. But it was his eyes that stopped me. Dark, assessing, already 3 moves ahead. He introduced himself as Alexei Volkov, said he understood I'd started my review. I chose my words carefully, told him the financial architecture was more complex than I'd been led to believe. Something flickered in his expression, not quite amusement. He said that was a diplomatic way of saying someone had been stealing from them. I agreed that was the direct version of what I'd been trying to be diplomatic about. He explained they'd hired an outsider because whoever was responsible knew their systems. They needed someone who thought differently. I asked what happened when I found that person. He was silent for a long moment, then said the problem would be solved. The way he said it made my skin prickle. He moved toward the door, paused. Suggested I not work too late. The estate was less friendly after dark. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. Somehow, that was worse. I didn't see Alexei again for 3 days. But I felt his presence everywhere. Every file I requested appeared within hours. Every question was answered with unusual speed. Someone was facilitating my work. Someone who wanted me to find what I was looking for. The pattern became clearer the more I dug. The thefts weren't random, they were surgical. Whoever was responsible knew exactly which accounts could lose money without triggering alerts. This was an inside job, and it had been going on for at least 2 years. On my 4th night, I was still at my desk at 11 p.m. The door opened. I assumed it was Irina. It wasn't. Alexei stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. He observed that I was working late. I reminded him he'd told me not to. He clarified, said it was less friendly after dark, not forbidden. He set 1 cup in front of me, Turkish, no sugar. I asked how he knew that was how I took it. He said he paid attention. That should have been romantic. Instead, it felt like surveillance. I took the coffee anyway. It was perfect. He settled into the chair across from my desk, asked if I'd found something. Not a question, a statement. I showed him what I'd discovered. 3 accounts that looked like operational expenses. But the vendors didn't exist. They were shells. Over 18 months, approximately $4 million. His expression didn't change as he studied the evidence. Asked how many people had the necessary access. I explained 7 people had that level of clearance, but 3 had been with the organization for over a decade. Their patterns were consistent, no red flags. Which left 4 suspects. He was quiet for a long time. Then said he wanted me to audit the remaining 4 personally, that he'd arrange privacy for the interviews. He looked at me then, not quite directly, but close enough that I could see his eyes clearly. They were tired, not physically tired, existentially tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying weight for so long you've forgotten what it feels like to put it down. He stood, moved to the door, paused with that same hesitation. Used my first name for the first time. Told me to be careful in the interviews, that if someone realized I was close to identifying them, they might become reactive. I asked what he meant. He said he'd prefer I didn't become collateral damage. Then he was gone. The interviews took 3 days. 4 people, 4 different reactions. The first was defensive, too many explanations. The second was bored, checked his phone twice. The third was charming, tried to turn the interrogation into a conversation. The fourth was quiet. Marina Volkov, Dimitri's cousin, late 30s, elegant. The kind of reserved competence that made her easy to overlook. She answered every question with precision. When I asked about a specific fraudulent payment, she suggested the processor should be investigated. Pointed me toward Victor, who'd been with the organization for 12 years. She was right, of course, but something about the exchange felt rehearsed. As she left, she gave me advice. Said to be careful about accusations, that in this family, loyalty mattered more than truth. Especially then. I found the proof 3 days later. Not in the financial records, but in metadata. Every document carried digital signatures, user IDs, timestamps, IP addresses. 53 fraudulent documents, 47 different user IDs. All created from the same 3 IP addresses. 2 belonged to office machines. The third was residential. Registered to Marina Volkov's home address. She'd been clever, using stolen credentials to create plausible deniability. Making it look distributed rather than centralized. But she'd made one mistake. She'd done it from home, where only her machines connected to the network. I compiled everything into a final report, hard evidence, clear conclusions. Then I called Alexei. He arrived within 20 minutes. Read the report standing, his expression unchanged. When he finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally confirmed it was Marina. Asked if I was certain. I explained the technical evidence was conclusive. He said Dimitri would want to confront her immediately. I asked what would happen to her. He said she was family, that the consequences would be measured. She'd be given a chance to explain, to make restitution if possible. I asked what happened if it wasn't possible. He said she'd be removed from authority, watched, prevented from causing further harm. I pushed for specifics. He said the specifics depended on what she said when confronted. I realized then what my careful investigation had built, what my precise documentation would lead to. And I understood what Alexei had been trying to protect me from. Not the knowledge of what he'd done, but understanding that I'd started to find his methods reasonable. That I was becoming what this place made people. The confrontation happened in Dimitri's office. Marina sat composed in a leather chair, navy suit, minimal jewelry. She didn't know she was already defeated. Dimitri stood by the windows, Alexei near the door. I sat with my laptop, ready to present evidence. Dimitri told Marina they'd completed the investigation, that they'd identified the source of the financial irregularities. Marina asked who it was. Dimitri's smile wasn't kind when he said it was her. Marina laughed, said it was ridiculous, that she'd been helping track these discrepancies herself. I pulled up the technical analysis, explained the IP addresses, the timestamps, the patterns. She studied the screen, her composure cracking. Said someone could have accessed her network, that the data could be manipulated. Alexei's voice cut through her explanation, quiet but absolute. Told her to stop. Said they'd confirmed the evidence independently, bank records, offshore accounts, deposits matching the fraudulent transfers. Marina's voice rose, asked if they'd investigated their own family. Dimitri said coldly that she'd stolen from her own family. For 2 years, $4 million. The composure shattered completely. She said she'd been owed that money, that she'd sacrificed everything for this family, that they'd never valued her because she was a woman, because she wasn't Dimitri's child. We all heard what she didn't say, because she had no power. Dimitri asked what she wanted. She said to fire her, let her disappear. Alexei said it wasn't that simple. Explained that letting her walk away created vulnerability they couldn't afford. That she'd tried to frame Victor. That wasn't just theft, it was sabotage. Marina realized she had no play left. Dimitri laid out the terms. Full restitution, offshore accounts transferred, complete accounting of her activities. If she complied, she could leave quietly, relocation assistance, severance, clean exit. She asked what happened if she refused. No one answered. She left without another word. Dimitri thanked me, said the bonus would be doubled. Told Alexei to handle Marina's transition. As I reached the door, I heard Dimitri say quietly to make sure she complied. Alexei said he would. Dimitri asked what happened if she didn't. There was a pause. Then Alexei said he'd make sure she couldn't cause any more problems. I left before I could hear the specifics. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marina's face when she realized she was cornered. The fear, the desperation. She'd stolen, that was undeniable. But she'd also been right. She'd spent years working for a family that never truly valued her. At 2 a.m., I gave up and went to my office. Found Alexei already there, sitting in the dark. He asked if I couldn't sleep either. I said no. We sat in silence for a while. I asked if Marina would actually leave quietly. He said probably not. Asked what he'd do. He said whatever was necessary. I pressed him, asked what that meant. He explained Marina knew they had leverage, family members she cared about, assets to protect. She'd comply because the alternative was worse. I asked what happened if she didn't. He was quiet. Then said she'd disappear, not killed, just relocated. Somewhere without extradition, without communication infrastructure, without any ability to hurt them. I said that sounded like a prison. He corrected me, said it was a consequence. I told him I'd helped do this to her. He said I'd done my job. I said that wasn't absolution. He agreed, said no, it wasn't. We sat in the darkness. Two people who'd helped corner a thief and were now waiting to see what that cornering would cost. Alexei asked what I'd thought would happen when I found the person responsible. I admitted I'd thought there would be legal consequences, termination, civil litigation. He said I hadn't thought about this. I agreed, because thinking about it would have made the work harder. He was right. I hated that he was right. He reminded me I'd said I could leave when this was over. I confirmed he'd meant it, but pointed out I was still here, at 2 a.m., unable to sleep because I was starting to understand the weight of what I'd done. He said that weight didn't go away. It just became familiar. I asked if that was what happened to him. He said, among other things. I admitted I wasn't sure I could do this. He stood, said then don't. Told me to finish my contract, take my bonus, go back to my legitimate clients and clean conscience. I said he made it sound simple. He agreed, said it was simple, just not easy. He moved toward the door, paused. Said for what it was worth, I'd done good work. That Marina was responsible for her own choices, not me. I told him he was trying to make me feel better. He said he was trying to give me permission to leave before I became something I didn't want to be. I asked what if I was already there. He looked at me for a long moment. Said then God help me, because he couldn't. Marina tried to run. I found out the next evening when Irina appeared at my office. Told me Dimitri wanted to see me immediately. Marina was there, flanked by guards, her composure gone. She looked terrified. Dimitri's voice was cold when he asked me to help Marina explain something. Why she'd attempted to access the Montenegro shipment records at 4 a.m. My stomach dropped. Dimitri explained she'd broken into the Port Authority system, downloaded manifests, client lists. Everything she'd need to sell their operations to competitors. Marina said desperately she'd been gathering insurance, in case they didn't honor their agreement. Dimitri said their agreement required cooperation, not corporate espionage. Alexei's voice was quiet when he said she'd proven she couldn't be trusted to leave quietly. Dimitri waved his hand, told the guards to take her to the facility. I said wait before I could stop myself. Everyone turned to look at me. I said she was scared, that she'd made a mistake. Dimitri interrupted, said she'd stolen, tried to frame someone, and attempted to steal operational intelligence. There was no but. I said what if she truly cooperated now? What if they gave her one more chance? Alexei's voice cut through my appeal, told me not to do this. I looked at him. He was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. I said she needed help, not imprisonment. Dimitri said flatly she needed consequences. Told me I needed to remember my role. I was a consultant, not a judge. Marina was led away. She looked back once at the door. The fear in her eyes made something twist in my chest. Dimitri said my contract was complete. That I'd been hired to identify the source of financial problems. I had. The matter was now resolved. I realized I was being dismissed, politely but definitively. Asked if he was terminating my contract. He corrected me, said fulfilling it. Thanked me for excellent work, said this next phase didn't require my expertise. The walk to my office was silent. When we reached the door, I finally spoke. Said Alexei had known. That's why he'd warned me not to say anything. He confirmed it. Asked why he hadn't told me before. He said, because I needed to see it for myself. Needed to understand what mercy cost in this world. I said Marina had been terrified. He agreed, said she'd earned that terror. I said she'd made one mistake. He corrected me, said she'd made multiple calculated decisions. That breaking into the Port Authority system wasn't panic, it was strategy. His voice was patient but firm when he explained the math. Saving her meant creating vulnerability for 200 other people. I said it was utilitarian math again. He said no, it was one person's consequences justified by her own choices. I wanted to argue, wanted to defend Marina. But I'd seen her face when the guards led her away. And I understood, finally, what Alexei had been trying to tell me. That every decision had casualties. That protection meant someone else paid the price. He said quietly that I didn't get to feel clean here. That I could be effective or comfortable with myself, rarely both. I said he'd chosen effectiveness. He said he'd chosen to be useful to people he cared about. The rest was just cost. I asked how he lived with it. He said he didn't think about it. I said that wasn't true. He admitted it wasn't, that he thought about it constantly. Just didn't let it paralyze him. I said I should pack. He agreed. But neither of us moved. Finally, he said what happened to Marina wasn't my fault. That she'd made choices, was paying for them. I was just the person who documented the evidence. I said that was a very clean way of assigning responsibility. He agreed, said if he let me believe I was responsible for every consequence, I'd never function again. He pushed off the doorframe, started to leave. I thanked him for trying to protect me. From this, from myself, from whatever he saw in me that worried him. He turned back, his control slipped for just a moment. Said he saw someone who still had a chance to get out. Told me not to waste it. Then he was gone. I lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of returning to my normal life, my legitimate clients. 3 weeks of sleeping better but feeling worse. Because the work was boring. Not boring because it was repetitive, boring because it was meaningless. Every analysis felt small, every solution temporary. I'd spent 3 months working on something that mattered. Something with stakes and consequences and real impact. I couldn't go back to pretending quarterly earnings reports were important. On the 21st day, I called the number on Alexei's card. He didn't answer. I called again 3 days later, still nothing. On the 32nd day, I drove back to Westchester. The guard recognized me, said I was no longer on the access list. I told him to tell Alexei I was here, that I needed 5 minutes. The guard made a call, brief conversation in Russian. Said Alexei wanted me to meet him at the North Garden. He opened the gate. Alexei was waiting among rose bushes, just beginning to bloom. He didn't look surprised. Said he'd told me not to come back. I said he'd told me a lot of things. He said I'd ignored most of them. I corrected him, said considered and rejected. He almost smiled, said that was worse. I told him I couldn't go back to my old work. It felt meaningless. He said that would pass, to give it time. I said I didn't think it would. He studied me, resignation in his expression. Said I wanted to come back, to work here again. I confirmed it. He moved closer, said he'd let me leave for a reason. Because I still had a chance to remain who I was. If I came back, I'd learn to justify things I used to hate. I said he'd already told me that. Asked if I thought I was prepared. I said I thought I was already there. He was quiet, studying me like he was trying to determine if I meant it. Then said Marina was still at the facility, would be there for at least another month. If I worked here again, I'd help with other investigations, other problems, other people who'd end up like her. I said I understood. He asked if I really did. Because understanding intellectually and living with it emotionally were different things. I asked him to teach me, to show me how he made these decisions without them destroying him. He stepped closer. Now we were inches apart. Said quietly that they did destroy him. He just didn't let it stop him from functioning. I told him to teach me that. He stared at me for a long moment, then laid out his terms. If I came back, I reported to him directly, not Dimitri. I worked on what he assigned, asked permission before investigating, accepted limitations on what I was allowed to know. And I never intervened on behalf of someone facing consequences. I asked why the restrictions. He said if I was going to do this work, I did it his way. Which meant he controlled my exposure to things that might break me. His voice softened slightly. Said he'd failed to protect me before. He wouldn't fail again. There it was, that careful restraint, that concern masked as professional boundary setting. I accepted his terms. He looked like he wanted to argue. Instead said I should start Monday, same office, different mandate. I asked what the mandate was. He said that depended on what problems arose. Turned to leave, paused. Told me not to make him regret this. I stood alone in the garden, surrounded by roses that bloomed despite their thorns. Understanding, I just made a choice I couldn't take back. That I'd crossed a line I didn't know existed until I was on the other side. And that the man who tried to protect me was now the one who would guide me through what came next. Because I'd asked him to. Because I wanted to understand. Because I'd fallen in love with something I couldn't name, but couldn't walk away from. Not the work, not the organization. The work changed. Before, I'd analyzed systems. Now I analyzed people. Alexei would bring files, not financial records, dossiers. Background on partners, suppliers, employees who'd raised concerns. He'd ask me what I saw. At first it felt invasive. But Alexei never asked without reason. Every file had context. This person had access and sudden debt. That person had family connections to rivals. He explained one evening that they weren't looking for guilt. They were looking for risk. Sometimes that meant someone was actively malicious. More often, it meant they were vulnerable to becoming malicious. Prevention was easier than remedy. The late nights started naturally. I'd work late. Alexei would appear with coffee, always Turkish, always perfect. At first, quick check-ins, 5 minutes. But gradually, they lengthened. He'd offer perspectives I hadn't considered. Insights into human behavior from years of observation. One night, he told me I was missing emotional pressure. Explained how a supervisor whose daughter was chronically ill carried resentment, not desperation. When I asked how he knew about the daughter, he said he paid attention. To everyone who mattered. I asked if that was exhausting. He said it was, but necessary. People didn't betray out of malice. They betrayed because they felt unseen, undervalued, trapped. If he saw them before that point, he could often address it. By addressing, he meant raises, schedule flexibility, medical support. Whatever actually helped. Violence was expensive and destabilizing. He preferred solving problems before they required violence. But he'd use violence if necessary. The honesty was almost refreshing. I asked how he decided when something crossed from addressable to terminal. He was quiet for a long moment. Finally said it was about intent. If someone stole because they were desperate, that was addressable. If they stole and framed others, creating additional victims, that was terminal. Not about the action, about willingness to harm others for self-protection. I asked quietly if he ever regretted his decisions. He said every single one. The answer surprised me. He explained that regret and necessity weren't mutually exclusive. He regretted that the world required these decisions, that he was the one making them. But he didn't regret the specific choices because the alternatives were worse. I said that was very rational. He said it was survival. He told me to get some sleep. The file could wait. I stopped him, asked why he kept coming here late at night. He could just get reports in the morning. He didn't answer immediately. Finally, said he needed to know I was okay. That this work wasn't changing me in ways I didn't want. I asked what happened if it was. He said then he'd stop giving me these assignments. Even if I was good at them. Especially then. He left before I could ask what he meant. But I understood. He was protecting me from becoming someone who was too good at this. From becoming like him. And somewhere in these weeks, that protection had started to feel less like professionalism. And more like something else. 3 weeks after I'd returned, we had the conversation I remember most clearly. Past midnight, I'd been reviewing a logistics coordinator's file. Alexei had been sitting with me for almost an hour, silent. I asked if I could ask something personal. He said I could ask. I asked how he'd ended up here, doing this. He said it was a long story. I said it was late, I had time. He studied me, deciding how much to share. Then set down his papers. Said he'd been a prosecutor in Moscow, long time ago. That surprised me. He'd handled corruption cases, government officials, organized crime, financial fraud. Said he'd believed in the system, thought justice was possible with proper documentation, procedures. I asked what changed. He said he'd won a case, major organized crime figure convicted properly, everything by the book. The man was murdered in prison 3 days later. Not by rivals, by the people he'd been cooperating with. He said the system worked exactly as designed, just wasn't designed for justice. It was designed for control. He realized all his careful documentation didn't matter. Power found a way, always. I asked if that's when he joined the other side. He corrected me, said he joined the side that's honest about what it is. Dmitri found him when he was unmoored, offered work that mattered. That protected people he cared about. That didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. He'd been doing it for 15 years. I tried to imagine 15 years of decisions no one else wanted to make. 15 years of carrying consequences most people couldn't conceptualize. Asked if he ever wanted to stop. He said every day. But someone had to do it. He was very good at it. And the people who would replace him would be worse. Said that wasn't nobility, just cost-benefit analysis. I said I thought it was more than that. That he cared about the people here, about minimizing harm. About doing this work with some vestige of humanity intact. He was quiet, Said I was romanticizing. I said I was observing. He said it was the same thing from a certain angle. We looked at each other across my office. I felt something shift, some acknowledgement of what had been building. This understanding, this connection forged through late-night conversations about morality and consequence. His voice was softer when he said I should go home. I asked why. He said if I stayed, we'd keep having these conversations. And these conversations were dangerous. I asked how. He said they created intimacy, and intimacy created vulnerability. He stopped himself. I asked what he couldn't do. He moved toward the door, away from me, creating distance deliberately. Said quietly, he couldn't let me become important to him. Because important people became leverage. And if I became leverage, I became a target. He asked me to go home, please. And I understood with devastating clarity that his restraint wasn't about professional boundaries. It was about protection. Protection from the inevitable consequences of caring in a world where caring was weakness. I sat alone for a long time, thinking about how he'd said important people became leverage. Like he was already worried I'd become important. Like maybe I already had. After that, I tested it. Not consciously at first, but in small ways. Staying later, knowing he'd check on me. Asking questions I didn't need answers to. Bringing coffee for him the way he brought it for me. He noticed, of course he noticed. But he didn't stop coming. Didn't stop the late-night check-ins, the conversations that stretched past midnight. The moments of vulnerability where he'd share fragments of his past. We developed a rhythm. I'd work on assessments. He'd handle implementation. We'd meet after everyone else had gone home. And we'd talk about everything except what was actually happening between us. It was intimacy by omission, connection through careful restraint. The most intense relationship I'd ever had. 6 weeks after I'd returned, everything changed. Or nothing changed, but we both stopped pretending. I'd finished an assessment on a shipping manager. My conclusion, not malicious, just incompetent. Alexei had been reading over my shoulder. Said I was getting better at seeing the difference between threat and noise. I credited him as a good teacher. He said he hadn't taught me that. I'd learned it by paying attention to people instead of just data. I turned in my chair. He was closer than usual. Standing rather than sitting. Close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. Asked why it mattered to him that I was good at this. He said because if I failed, it was his failure. I said that wasn't all of it. He admitted it wasn't. He moved away, creating distance. Stood in the middle of my office, hands in pockets. Expression unreadable. Said quietly, he saw what was happening to me. The person I was when I first came here, nervous, optimistic, believing I could remain unchanged, was gone. I was hardening, learning to categorize people, to assess risk. To accept that consequences were sometimes brutal. I asked if he was saying I was becoming like him. He said I was becoming what this work required. And he wasn't sure that was good. I pointed out he kept giving me assignments. He said because I'd asked, because I was good at it. He stopped. I asked him to finish. He said because he was selfish. I asked how this was selfish. He said every night I stayed, every conversation we had, every moment he spent watching me adapt. It made him feel less alone. The honesty hit me physically. I told him he wasn't alone. He said he'd been alone for 15 years, just very good at functioning anyway. I said he didn't have to be. He looked at me then, really looked. And I saw everything he'd been hiding. Loneliness, exhaustion, longing, fear. He said quietly that yes, he did have to be. I asked why. He said if I stayed, if I kept doing this work, kept having these conversations, I'd learn to justify things I used to hate. Wake up one day and realize I'd crossed lines I didn't know existed. And he wouldn't be the reason that happened. I said I was already here, already doing this work. He hadn't made me come back. He said no, but he'd let me stay. That was worse. I asked why. He said because he'd known what it would cost me. Let it happen anyway, because he wanted. He stopped himself again. I asked what he'd wanted. He moved to the door. I knew he was about to leave, about to retreat into that careful restraint. I stood, called his name, asked what he'd wanted. He paused in the doorway, his back to me. Said quietly he'd wanted to not be alone. Even if only for a few hours at night. Even if it meant watching me become something I wasn't supposed to be. He'd wanted someone who understood. I said I did understand. He said that's what he was afraid of. I stood alone. Understanding, finally, what had been building between us. Not romance in any conventional sense. Not even attraction, though that was there. It was recognition. Two people who'd crossed lines and couldn't go back. Two people who understood the weight of consequence in ways that isolated them from everyone else. Two people trying to find connection in a world where connection was dangerous. He was protecting me from himself. I was trying to prove I didn't need protection. And neither of us was willing to admit we actually wanted each other. After the shift, after that night, something changed. Alexei still came, still brought coffee, still reviewed my work. Still had those conversations that revealed more than either intended. But there was a new quality, a carefulness beyond professionalism. He'd stand farther away than necessary, leave earlier, cut conversations short when they got too personal. He was creating distance deliberately. And it was driving me insane. Because now that I'd recognized what this was, this connection, this understanding, this intimacy with nothing to do with touch, I couldn't stop wanting more of it. I found excuses to stay later, asked more questions, pushed conversations past his comfort zone. And he let me, which meant he wanted it too. We were both trapped in this dance of advance and retreat. Neither willing to cross the final line, but neither able to walk away. Until the night, I asked the question I'd been avoiding. We were in my office. He was reading something on his phone. I asked if he thought about me when he wasn't there. He looked up slowly, said my name like a warning. I continued, said I thought about him all the time. When working, when home, when trying to sleep. Thought about these conversations, about how he saw the world. About how he carried weight and still managed to be careful with people. He told me to stop. I asked why. He said if I kept talking, he'd say something he couldn't take back. I told him to say it. He stood, moved toward me, not to leave this time, closer. Asked if I wanted honesty. His voice was low, intense. Said he thought about me constantly. Every decision he made, he wondered how I'd assess it. Every file he gave me, he worried it would break something fundamental in who I was. Every night I stayed late, he told himself to send me home. Then came anyway because he needed. He stopped. I whispered, asking what he needed. He said to see that someone still looked at him like he was human. Not a tool, not a threat, just human. We were inches apart now. He said quietly that if we crossed this line, he couldn't protect me anymore. Not from this world, not from him, not from what this work would make me. I said maybe I didn't need protection. He said everyone needed protection, especially from the people they cared about. I asked if that's what this was, caring. He looked at me with those dark, exhausted eyes. 15 years of loneliness, of carrying weight alone, of being the person everyone relied on and no one truly knew. He said yes, God help him, yes. Then stepped back, creating distance again. Protecting us both from what that admission meant. Told me to go home before he forgot why we couldn't do this. I asked, what if I didn't want to go home? He said he was asking anyway, please. The please broke me. Because it wasn't a command, it was a request. From a man who never asked for anything. Who handled everything himself. Who carried every burden without complaint. He was asking me to help him maintain the distance. Because if I didn't leave, he wouldn't have the strength to keep it himself. I gathered my things, left. But driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. That he thought about me constantly. That he needed to see someone look at him like he was human. That he'd asked me to leave because he was afraid of what would happen if I stayed. He was protecting me, but also protecting himself. From hope, maybe, or from the possibility of something that would make this unbearable life even harder. I realized then that I'd fallen in love with a man who would never let himself love me back. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he felt it too much. And in his world, love was a liability neither of us could afford. 2 weeks later, Alexei came to my office with a different kind of file. Said there was a situation, an employee who'd been stealing shipment manifests. Small scale but consistent, Dimitri wanted it addressed. I asked what he'd do. He said the usual, offer choice, cooperation or consequences. I asked if I could be there. He looked at me for a long moment. Said once I saw this, I couldn't unsee it. Wouldn't blame me if I left immediately after. I said I wouldn't leave. He said we'd see. The man's name was Victor, early 30s, married, 2 kids. He'd been selling manifest information to a competitor for extra money. Not huge amounts, maybe 5,000 over 3 months. But enough to compromise security. We met him in a conference room I'd never seen. Basement level, no windows. The kind of space designed for private conversations. Victor was already there, flanked by security. He looked terrified. Alexei's demeanor changed when we entered. The man I'd been talking to last night disappeared. Replaced by something colder, more controlled, professional. He thanked Victor for coming, said he imagined Victor knew why he was there. Victor stammered that he didn't. Alexei explained calmly that Victor had been selling information to Kozlov's operation. Said they had evidence, phone records, deposit patterns, testimony. That he wasn't there to debate whether it happened. They knew it did. He was there to discuss what happened next. Victor pleaded, said he needed the money, his daughter's medical bills. Alexei's voice remained steady when he said he knew about Victor's daughter. Type 1 diabetes, insulin costs, the medical system was broken. Victor shouldn't have had to choose between his daughter's health and loyalty. But he had made a choice, and that choice had consequences. Victor was shaking, said he'd stop, never do it again. Alexei said it wasn't about whether he'd do it again. It was about what he'd already done. He'd compromised operations, put people at risk, created vulnerability. That couldn't be undone. Victor asked what would happen to him. Alexei said that depended on him, that he was offering 2 choices. His voice remained calm, almost kind, but there was steel underneath. Choice 1, complete cooperation. Tell them everything, return the money, submit to ongoing monitoring. Continue working, but in reduced capacity with no sensitive access. Salary garnishment to repay the debt. But he kept his job. His daughter kept her insurance. His family stayed intact. Victor nodded frantically, said yes, he'd do that. Alexei said he wasn't finished. His voice hardened slightly. Choice 2, refuse cooperation. Claim innocence, make this difficult. In which case, they wouldn't file criminal charges. That would expose their operations. Instead, Victor would simply lose everything. Job, references, professional reputation. They'd ensure he couldn't work anywhere in this industry. His wife would lose her position. His daughter would lose her insurance. And he'd spend the rest of his life trying to rebuild from nothing. The threat was delivered calmly, almost gently. But Victor understood. He whispered that was blackmail. Alexei said no, that was consequences. Victor had made choices that hurt this organization. They were offering a path forward that minimized damage on both sides. Or Victor could choose to be difficult, and they'd minimize damage on their side only. I watched this exchange. Watched Alexei systematically strip away Victor's options. And I understood what he'd been trying to protect me from. Not violence, not brutality. But this, the calm dismantling of someone's life. The surgical precision of leverage. The way he could destroy a person without ever raising his voice. Victor whispered he'd cooperate, please. He'd do whatever they wanted. Alexei's expression didn't change. Said Victor would meet with security tomorrow. Full debriefing. Salary garnishment started immediately, 20% until the debt was repaid. Report any unusual contacts. Accept monitoring without complaint. Asked if Victor understood. Victor said yes. Alexei told him to think very carefully before doing anything other than cooperate. Victor left, escorted by security. Alexei and I were alone in the conference room. He turned to me, asked well. I was supposed to be horrified. Supposed to see him as the monster he kept insisting he was. Instead, I said he'd given Victor a choice. He said he'd given him an illusion of choice. Both options served their interests. I pointed out he could have just destroyed Victor. Dimitri probably wanted that. Instead, he'd created a path where Victor kept his job. His daughter kept insurance. His family stayed together. Alexei said that was because destroying Victor would be wasteful and cruel when cooperation served the same purpose. I said he was describing efficiency. I was describing mercy. He insisted it wasn't mercy. It was calculation. Keeping Victor employed and monitored was more valuable than firing him and creating an enemy. I asked what would have happened if Victor had refused. Alexei was quiet, then said he would have done exactly what he'd threatened. Destroyed Victor's career, ensured he couldn't work, leveraged his family situation. Not because he wanted to, but because that's what maintaining power required. I pointed out Victor hadn't refused. Alexei said most people didn't. That's what I didn't understand. Violence was rarely necessary if you understood leverage. If you knew what people cared about and credibly threatened it. I moved closer, asked if he thought showing me this would make me leave. He said yes. I asked why. He said because I just watched him threaten a man's family to ensure cooperation. Watched him systematically strip away options until there was no choice but compliance. And I was acting like it was reasonable. I said it was reasonable. His voice rose slightly, the most agitation I'd ever heard from him. He said I was justifying it, seeing threats to children as leverage, calling systemic coercion mercy. That's exactly what he'd been afraid would happen. I was becoming someone who could rationalize this. And he couldn't watch that happen and pretend he wasn't responsible. He moved toward the door, said I needed to leave. Not in 3 days, now, tonight. Pack my things, take my severance, go back to my life. Before I became someone who thought threatening families was acceptable business practice. I said he was panicking. He turned back, said he was seeing clearly for the first time in weeks. That he'd let me stay because he was lonely, because he wanted connection. Because he'd convinced himself I understood what I was getting into. But I didn't. I was adapting, rationalizing, losing parts of myself I wouldn't get back. And he wouldn't be responsible for that. I said he didn't get to make this choice for me. He said yes, he did, because someone had to protect me from myself. The words came out louder than I intended. I said I wasn't Irina. I wasn't going to look at him with horror and leave. I wasn't going to realize one day I couldn't stomach what he did. I was looking at it right now, seeing it clearly. And I was still here. He said for now. I said for always, if he'd let me. He stared at me. I saw everything warring in his expression. Want and fear and exhaustion, and that bone-deep loneliness. He whispered he couldn't let me stay. Because if I stayed, he'd start a hope. And hope was dangerous. Hope made you vulnerable. Hope meant believing in futures that didn't exist for people like him. I asked what if that future could exist. He said it couldn't. I asked how he knew. He said because he'd spent 15 years learning exactly what was possible in this life. And lasting connection wasn't on the list. We stood in that windowless room. And I understood finally I couldn't win this argument. Couldn't convince him through logic or emotion that we could survive together. Because he didn't believe he deserved it. I said okay quietly. He looked surprised, asked me to repeat that. I said I'd leave, tonight like he wanted. But I needed him to do something first. He asked what. I moved closer, close enough to touch him. Close enough to see the exhaustion, the silver in his hair. The weight he carried in every line of his face. I asked him to kiss me one more time, and then I'd go. He looked at me like I was asking for something impossible. I said one kiss, and then I promised. I'd leave, go back to my life, let him push me away. Do everything he thought was best. But I needed to know this was real. That it wasn't just proximity or intensity or circumstances. That what I felt for him actually existed, even if it couldn't last. He stared at me for a long moment. Then crossed the distance between us. Pulled me into his arms. And kissed me. Not carefully this time, not controlled. This was everything he'd been holding back. Desperation, longing, grief, love. This was goodbye and I'm sorry, and I wish things were different all at once. When he pulled away, there were tears on my face. I whispered that I loved him. His voice was rough when he said he knew. That's why I had to leave. He stepped back, creating distance again. Protecting both of us from what staying would mean. Told me to go pack my things. He'd have Irina arrange transportation. I started to say his name. He said please. His voice cracked. Asked me to please just go, before he changed his mind. And as I walked away, I heard him say quietly, so quietly I almost missed it. I'm sorry. I packed quickly, threw belongings into bags without organizing. Just wanting to be done. Loading the last box into my car when Irina appeared. Said Alexei had asked her to give me something. She handed me an envelope, thick, heavy. I asked what it was. She said my severance, and something else. I opened it, cash, more than I'd expected. Along with a letter, Alexei's handwriting. I read it standing there in the driveway. The letter explained everything. The money was my severance, plus 6 months additional. Not compensation, insurance. So I had time to find my next position without pressure. So I'd never have to compromise myself for financial necessity. He'd enclosed a recommendation letter and contact information for legitimate consulting firms. Told me to use them, build the career I should have had before I met him. Then came the truth. In 3 days, federal investigators would arrest Dimitri on RICO charges. Evidence compiled months ago by internal sources. Investigation ongoing for over a year. Dimitri didn't know yet. He was telling me for 2 reasons. First, so I'd be prepared. I might be contacted for testimony. I had limited exposure. My work was analytical, not operational. But I should secure a lawyer. He'd included a name. Second, so I'd understand that this organization was collapsing. Not because of my departure, because the systems were catching up. This world, the one he'd tried to protect me from, was ending. At least in its current form. He wasn't leaving. He'd face whatever came. That was the cost he'd always known he'd pay. But I didn't have to pay it with him. I was free, clear. I'd done nothing that would implicate me in criminal charges. He'd made sure of that. The letter ended with thanks. For seeing him as human, for those late-night conversations. For trying to understand what he was without walking away. He said I'd asked if he ever regretted his decisions. That he regretted everything except protecting me. Said he hoped someday I'd understand why he had to let me go. Signed with just his initial, A. I read the letter twice. Then I understood. This wasn't just about protecting me from becoming like him. This was about protecting me from what was coming next. He'd known for months. That Dimitri would be arrested, that the organization would collapse, that everyone involved would face investigation. And he'd systematically positioned me outside that collapse. Made sure my work was analytical, made sure I'd leave before the arrests. Made sure I'd be clear. He'd protected me one final time. At the cost of his own future. I looked at Irina, asked if she'd known. She said yes, about the investigation. Asked if Alexei had arranged my departure because of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then said he'd been arranging my departure since the day I came back. Every assignment was designed to either push me away or give me an exit. Today just accelerated the timeline. I said he'd been protecting me from the beginning. Irina agreed. Said he'd been protecting me from himself since he realized he cared about me. That's what he did, protected people. Even when it destroyed him to do it. I asked if I could see him one more time, to say goodbye properly. Irina said he'd specifically asked that I leave without saying goodbye. Said if he saw me again, he wouldn't be able to let me go. Of course he did. Of course, his final act of protection was removing even the possibility of me staying. I told Irina to tell him I understood. And that he was wrong about one thing. She asked what. I said I wouldn't forget about him, not eventually, not ever. Irina smiled sadly. Said he knew that. That's part of why he sent me away. Because if I'd stayed, if he'd let himself hope, The coming collapse would have destroyed us both. This way, at least I survived. I asked what about him. She said he'd survive too, in his way. He always did. I got in my car, drove away. And in my rearview mirror, I watched the estate disappear. I was leaving behind the only person who'd ever truly seen me. All my compromises, all my rationalizations, all the ways I'd learned to justify the unjustifiable. And loved me anyway. The man who'd protected me from everything, including himself. 3 years later. The news broke on a Tuesday. Federal prosecutors announced a major RICO case against the Volkov organization. Multiple arrests, seizures of assets. A cooperating witness who'd provided extensive documentation. I watched the coverage from my apartment in Boston, where I'd rebuilt my career, doing legitimate consulting for nonprofits. Good work, important work, work that let me sleep at night. Most nights. The cooperating witness was Alexei. He'd testified against Dimitri, against the organization. Provided evidence that would send dozens of people to prison for decades. In exchange, he'd received immunity. Not because he was innocent, the news made that clear, but because his testimony was valuable enough to warrant protection. They showed his photo, older than I remembered, more gray in his hair. But those same dark eyes, that same careful composure. The reporter called him the organization's enforcer. The man responsible for countless acts of intimidation, coercion, and violence. They didn't understand. They saw a criminal who'd turned on his employer, a betrayer who'd sold out for immunity. I saw something else. I saw a man who'd spent 15 years protecting people who didn't deserve protection, who'd carried weight that would have crushed anyone else, who'd made impossible decisions with devastating precision, who'd loved me enough to send me away before the collapse, who'd planned this for months, maybe years, who'd positioned people he cared about outside the blast radius, who'd documented everything carefully, systematically, building a case that would dismantle the organization while protecting as many people as possible. Even in destruction, he was careful. Even in betrayal, he was trying to minimize harm. I picked up my phone, called the number from the card he'd given me years ago. The one I'd kept in my wallet, even though I'd never used it. It went to voicemail, his voice recorded, probably years old. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I sent a text. Said I'd seen the news, that I understood, that I hoped he was okay. I didn't expect a response. But 3 days later, my phone buzzed. He said he was okay, asked if I was. Such a simple question, such a loaded question. I said I was okay, built a good life, like he'd said I would. He said good. I asked if he'd planned this, the testimony, the immunity, all of it. A long pause. He said yes. I asked how long. He said since the day I came back, maybe before. I asked why he hadn't told me. He explained that if I'd known, I would have stayed, tried to help, become implicated. This way, I was clear. I said he'd protected me. He said always. I stared at that single word, feeling everything I'd been holding back for 3 years. Asked if I could see him. Another long pause. He said no. I asked why not. He explained he was in witness protection now. New life, new name. He couldn't have connections to his old life. It wasn't safe for either of us. I said I didn't care about safe. He said he knew, but he did. I asked if this was it, if we'd never see each other again. He said yes. I started to protest. He asked me to please let him do this one last thing for me. Let him protect me by staying away. I asked, what if I didn't want protection? He said I never did, but I was getting it anyway. I sat with my phone in my hands, reading and rereading those words, understanding that this was goodbye. Real goodbye, final goodbye. I asked if he'd be okay, wherever he was. He said eventually, asked about me. I said same. He said my name then, like a question. I responded. He thanked me for trying to stay, for seeing him as human. For those months when he wasn't alone. I told him I loved him. He said he knew. That's why he was saying goodbye. And then nothing. I waited for hours, days. But he didn't respond again. The number went dead a week later, disconnected, no forwarding information. He was gone, completely, intentionally, protecting both of us from the possibility of connection. Because that's what he did. He protected people, even when it meant destroying himself to do it. 5 years later, I was giving a lecture on financial forensics at a conference in Chicago. When the lecture ended, I found an envelope slipped under my hotel room door. Inside was a single page, his handwriting. The note said he knew he'd promised to stay away, but he'd needed to see me one more time. To see that I was okay, that I'd built the life he'd hoped for. Said I looked good, happy or close to it. The work I was doing mattered. I was helping people in ways that didn't require compromise. That's what he'd wanted for me. He said he was okay too. Different name, different life. Quiet work that didn't require the kinds of decisions he used to make. He slept better now, most nights. Said he wouldn't contact me again. This was closure. Not for me. I probably had closure years ago. For him, he'd needed to see that protecting me was worth it. That I'd survived intact. Said he hoped I'd find someone who could give me what he couldn't. That I deserved that, deserved everything. Thanked me for seeing him when no one else could. Signed with just his initial, A. I read the letter until I'd memorized it. Then I went to the hotel bar and ordered whiskey I didn't drink. Staring at nothing, thinking about a man who'd loved me enough to disappear. I never saw him again. Sometimes I'd think I'd catch a glimpse, someone in a crowd with his posture. His careful way of observing without being observed. But it was never him, just wishful thinking, just grief wearing familiar shapes. I built my life, good work, good relationships. Eventually, someone who cared about me and didn't require the kind of emotional intensity Alex I and I had existed in. It was comfortable, safe, sustainable. It wasn't what I'd had with Alex I. But maybe that was the point. What we did wasn't sustainable. It was intense and meaningful and ultimately impossible. But that didn't make it less real. Years later. I'm older now, established, respected in my field. I teach ethics in financial forensics. I help organizations identify and prevent corruption. I help people do the right thing. It's ironic, maybe, that I spent months learning to rationalize the unjustifiable. And now I spend my career teaching people how to avoid those rationalizations. But I'm good at it precisely because I understand the temptation. I know what it's like to see gray areas where others see black and white. I know what it's like to care about someone who does terrible things for understandable reasons. I know what it's like to love someone and let them go because staying would destroy you both. Sometimes students ask me how I got into this work. What made me passionate about ethics and accountability and doing the right thing even when it's difficult? I never tell them the real answer. I never say I fell in love with a man who spent 15 years making impossible decisions, who carried weight that would have crushed me, who protected me from everything, including himself, who taught me that love sometimes means walking away. That protection sometimes means disappearing. That the most honest thing you can do is refuse to let someone you love become something they'll hate. I never say he sent me away because he loved me. And that's the most devastating gift I've ever received. Instead, I say something generic about believing systems can be better, about wanting to help people navigate difficult ethical situations, about the importance of accountability. It's true enough, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is this: I survived because he stayed behind, because he made sure I left before the collapse, because he protected me even when it meant protecting me from him. He disappeared into witness protection, into obscurity, into a life I'll never know about. Gave up his name, his history, his connections. All to testify, all to dismantle what he'd helped build. All to make sure people like me didn't get caught in the destruction. I hope he found peace. I hope wherever he is, whatever name he uses now, he sleeps at night. I hope he's not alone. I hope someone sees him the way I saw him. Not as the enforcer, not as the criminal, not as the betrayer, but as a person who did terrible things for comprehensible reasons, and still somehow maintained enough humanity to protect the people he cared about. I hope he knows I understood, in the end, why he sent me away, why he disappeared, why he protected me even when I didn't want protection. I hope he knows it was worth it. Because I'm here, building good things, helping people, making choices I can live with, sleeping most nights without nightmares. I survived because he loved me enough to let me go. And that's the most honest love story I know.